The trouble began with 2 police cruisers screeching into our cul-de-sac like we were running a meth lab instead of overwatering our hydrangeas. My wife was still in her pajamas, sipping coffee, when the officers jumped out and shouted for her to put her hands where they could see them. It would have been terrifying if it weren't so absurd, because the woman they were barking at was not only my wife but also the duly elected county sheriff. I froze on the porch, halfway between laughing and yelling, watching as she calmly set her mug on the railing and asked if they were here about the pink flamingos. That was the spark, the collision of petty neighborhood politics with real authority, and it all started because our homeowners association thought they had more power than the law itself. The days leading up to that spectacle had been deceptively quiet. It began with a letter taped to our front door, printed in capital letters as though a middle schooler had discovered the bold button. It claimed that we were in violation of community regulations for keeping our trash cans in plain view, despite the fact that every neighbor's cans were lined up like soldiers on the same curb. My wife read it once, sighed, and slid it under a stack of mail without comment. She had bigger issues on her plate: real crime, real emergencies. A plastic bin left outside on a Tuesday was hardly going to register in her universe. The HOA president, however, lived for such crusades. His name was Gerald, though everyone knew him as Jerry the Clipboard, a man whose chest puffed up whenever he walked down the street in his cargo shorts and tucked polo. His power came not from a badge or election by the masses but from the thin line of signatures he had hustled together to form an association in the first place. Jerry thrived on complaints like plants thrive on sunlight. To him, each minor infraction was a personal insult, a direct threat to the fragile order he believed he maintained. A week after the trash can incident, another notice appeared. This time it was about the lawn, which Jerry claimed was a 1/4 inch too long. My wife raised an eyebrow as she read it aloud, asking if Jerry had taken up a side job as a barber measuring fades. I laughed, but she didn't. She saw through it already. This was less about rules and more about dominance. HOA presidents never admitted they were powerless in the real world, so they clung to the only patch of turf they could control. The neighbors began whispering too. Mrs. Patterson across the street, who never left her blinds open unless there was drama to spy on, remarked loudly one morning that my wife seemed to think she was above the rules. Mr. Liu, usually quiet and polite, nervously mentioned that Jerry was talking about holding a compliance hearing. The absurdity of it all was building, but we tried to ignore it, hoping indifference would starve the fire. Unfortunately, Jerry mistook silence for weakness. The first confrontation happened on a Saturday when my wife was trimming the roses. Jerry stormed up our driveway clutching his clipboard like a weapon. He didn't bother with greetings. He began rattling off infractions in a nasal tone that made each word sound like it was pulled through a kazoo. Lawn too long. Decorative lights not approved. Garden gnome violating aesthetic harmony. My wife listened without flinching, nodding occasionally like she was taking a witness statement. Finally, when he paused for air, she simply asked if he had finished. Jerry puffed up, mistaking her calm for intimidation. He told her she would regret ignoring his authority, that the HOA had ways of enforcing compliance. He said this while standing in a yard that had just hosted 3 block parties she personally helped shut down because of noise complaints. She didn't need to remind him of her real authority. Not yet. She simply returned to her roses, leaving him sputtering down the driveway, the sound of his sandals slapping pavement like punctuation marks to his fury. 2 nights later, the situation escalated. Jerry filed an official complaint, accusing us of hostile behavior and suspected illegal activity on the property. The claim was laughably vague, but apparently convincing enough to his allies on the board. What he didn't realize was that involving outside enforcement would expose his pettiness on a grand stage. That's how we arrived at the moment where 2 police cruisers rolled up with lights flashing, startling the neighborhood cats and sending Mrs. Patterson scrambling for her binoculars. The officers approached with hands near their belts. Barking orders like this was a takedown. My wife remained perfectly still, sipping her coffee until one of them demanded she put the mug down. She did so with a deliberate slowness, eyes calm, expression unreadable. When they asked her to identify herself, she reached into her robe pocket and pulled out her badge. The silence that followed was almost comical. One officer blinked, the other stammered, and Jerry, who had emerged from behind his hedge to watch his plan unfold, suddenly looked like a man who had tried to trap a tiger with a cardboard box. The revelation rippled through the cul-de-sac like a thunderclap. Neighbors gasped, whispers flew, and Mrs. Patterson nearly dropped her binoculars. My wife didn't raise her voice, didn't gloat. She simply stated her name, her title, and asked which of them had authorized this farce of a visit. The officers exchanged glances, clearly wishing they were anywhere else. One muttered about a complaint from the HOA. That was the moment Jerry realized he was standing in quicksand. But instead of retreating, he doubled down. He marched forward, trying to cover his embarrassment with bluster, declaring that sheriff or not, my wife still had to follow neighborhood rules. He accused her of intimidating neighbors with her position, of believing herself untouchable. His words echoed through the night, a mix of desperation and arrogance. My wife simply tilted her head, studying him like she was profiling a suspect. The officers, sensing they had been dragged into something ridiculous, began retreating to their cruisers. My wife dismissed them with a nod, thanking them for their service before turning her attention fully to Jerry. She asked him, in that level tone that could chill the air, if he understood the difference between a civic association and actual law. Jerry's lips moved, but no words came out. The crowd of neighbors, drawn by flashing lights, watched with wide eyes, waiting to see who would break first. That was the night the balance of power shifted. What Jerry thought would be his grand triumph turned into a public unraveling. My wife walked back inside with the same calm she had left with, leaving the neighborhood buzzing in stunned disbelief. I followed her, heart still pounding, realizing that what began as a petty letter about trash cans had now become something much bigger. And Jerry, red-faced and trembling in the dark, was already plotting his next move. The fallout from that night spread like wildfire through the neighborhood. By breakfast the next morning, half the cul-de-sac had somehow seen or heard a version of events that painted my wife as a tyrant and Jerry as a brave defender of order. The other half knew the truth, that Jerry had been humiliated in front of flashing lights and an entire audience of curious onlookers. Either way, the story had legs, and people loved repeating it. My wife, unfazed as always, buttered her toast and said only that Jerry would not let it go. I believed her. She knew the type. Power-drunk, cornered, and convinced the rules were the only things separating civilization from chaos. Jerry was going to double down, and we both knew it. It didn't take long. By that evening, another letter appeared, this one marked in red ink as if he had borrowed a schoolteacher's pen. The tone was harsher now, accusing us of bringing disgrace upon the community, of exploiting her office to intimidate honest volunteers. Jerry had begun using words like misconduct and ethical violation. It was no longer about trash cans or lawns. It was about painting her as the villain in his neighborhood opera. I read it aloud, and halfway through my wife chuckled, remarking that Jerry had clearly been reading too many courtroom dramas. She filed the letter away without comment, but the gleam in her eyes told me she was already cataloging evidence, like she would in a real case. Neighbors began to pick sides. Some drifted toward us, muttering that Jerry had gone too far, while others rallied around his crusade. Mrs. Patterson set up lawn chairs across from our house, claiming she wanted more fresh air but clearly using it as a surveillance post. Mr. Liu avoided eye contact, clearly torn between reason and fear of Jerry's clipboard. The atmosphere had shifted from mild annoyance to a cold war. Every gesture was loaded with tension. Every glance across the hedge was suspect. My wife, meanwhile, played it cool. She didn't confront Jerry or even acknowledge his letters beyond dropping them into a growing folder she labeled neighborhood theatrics. When I asked her why she wasn't striking back, she told me the most dangerous opponent is the one who reveals his playbook too early. Jerry was doing just that. By hurling accusations and gathering allies, he was showing her exactly where he planned to strike. And she, unlike him, had patience. But Jerry wasn't content with letters. He wanted spectacle. 2 days later, the HOA board announced a special meeting to discuss what they called repeated violations of community standards. The flyer, slipped under every door, was dripping with drama. Words like crisis, accountability, and urgent need filled the page. It might as well have been an invitation to a theater production. My wife pinned it to the fridge like a child's artwork, saying only that she hoped Jerry brought popcorn for everyone. Behind the scenes, Jerry was scheming harder. We heard from a neighbor that he had been digging into county records, trying to find anything on my wife that could be twisted into scandal. Another neighbor whispered that he had hired someone to drive by our house late at night, taking photos of supposed violations. The man was running a smear campaign on a scale no sane person would attempt over lawn clippings and gnomes. But in his mind, this wasn't about lawns anymore. It was about winning. The anonymous complaint came next. One afternoon, a letter arrived at the sheriff's office addressed to the county ethics board, claiming my wife was abusing her position by intimidating neighbors and using her badge as a shield against consequences. It had no signature, but the phrasing was pure Jerry. When my wife read it, she shook her head and muttered that amateurs always leave fingerprints, even when they think they are clever. She didn't tell him she had seen the complaint. She wanted him to keep walking deeper into his own trap. The neighborhood, meanwhile, was eating it up. The story had become entertainment, whispered about over fences and passed along at the grocery store. People speculated whether the sheriff would be removed, whether Jerry would finally break her, whether the HOA would win against the law. It was no longer a dispute. It was a saga. And my wife, though calm, was not one to let her reputation be dragged through the mud unchecked. She told me one night, as we sat on the porch watching Jerry patrol with his flashlight like a mall cop, that there would come a moment when she would step in. But it would be on her terms. The high point of the escalation came at the special HOA meeting. The community center was packed, neighbors crammed into folding chairs while Jerry strutted at the front like a dictator addressing his cabinet. He opened with a long speech about rules and fairness, peppered with dramatic pauses and pointed glances in our direction. My wife sat still in the second row, arms folded, her expression unreadable. When Jerry began reading off our supposed violations, lights too bright, hedges uneven, unauthorized lawn ornaments, he did so with the flourish of a man who thought he was delivering damning evidence. Halfway through, a murmur rippled through the crowd. People were realizing how absurd the list was. Garden gnomes as threats to community safety. Trash cans as harbingers of disorder. Decorative lights as symbols of rebellion. Jerry, oblivious, pressed on, until finally my wife raised her hand. The room fell quiet, as if the sheriff had just taken the stand in court. She asked, in her calm voice, whether Jerry could produce the specific section of the HOA charter that banned pink flamingos. Jerry faltered, shuffling through his papers, sweating under the fluorescent lights. The crowd chuckled, and he tried to regain control, but the seed of doubt had been planted. The meeting ended without resolution, but the tension had shifted. Jerry no longer looked like the unquestioned leader of the HOA. He looked rattled. My wife, on the other hand, walked out with quiet dignity, neighbors parting to let her through. The battle lines were drawn more clearly than ever. Jerry was going to keep pushing, desperate to regain the upper hand, but my wife had patience, resources, and a badge. That night, as we sat in the living room, she told me this was no longer about us. Jerry's crusade was poisoning the neighborhood, dividing people who had once been friendly into suspicious camps. She wasn't just going to defend herself, she was going to fix it. She leaned back in her chair, eyes sharp, and said the words that made my stomach flip. "I'll handle this my way." The escalation was complete. Jerry had turned a petty squabble into a war, and my wife was done letting him set the terms. The sheriff was about to take the reins, and Jerry had no idea the storm he had invited onto his own doorstep. The HOA announced a special hearing 2 weeks later, and Jerry was treating it like the Super Bowl. Flyers went out across the neighborhood with words like urgent and critical printed in bold letters, as if the fate of civilization hinged on the positioning of our garden gnomes. He even set up a podium in the community center, complete with a rented microphone and a banner that read preserving neighborhood values. It was theater, plain and simple, and Jerry was the self-cast hero. My wife, on the other hand, treated it like another day at work. She ironed her uniform shirt that morning, not because she intended to wear it but because it gave her calm. When I asked what her plan was, she just smiled and said, watch him burn himself. By the time we arrived, the parking lot was overflowing. People were lined up outside the building, whispering, laughing, and clutching their copies of the HOA charter as though they were sacred texts. Inside, neighbors had split into factions. Jerry loyalists clustered near the front, whispering encouragement, while skeptics leaned against the back wall, arms folded, waiting to see blood drawn. The tension was so thick you could have spread it on crackers. Jerry opened the hearing with dramatic flair, banging a gavel he had clearly purchased for this exact moment. He began rattling off our supposed crimes against the neighborhood in his usual nasal tone. Unauthorized flamingos. Trash cans out of alignment. Lights deemed too festive. Each accusation was accompanied by a photo projected onto a screen, as if he were presenting evidence in a criminal trial. The problem was that the photos were laughable. One blurry shot of our recycling bin looked more like modern art than scandal, and the flamingos looked positively cheerful. A murmur of amusement spread through the crowd, and Jerry's face tightened. My wife sat quietly, hands folded in her lap. She didn't interrupt, didn't object. She let him talk himself into exhaustion. When he finally paused for breath, she leaned forward and asked if he could cite the exact bylaw that made pink flamingos illegal. The room fell silent, and Jerry fumbled with his papers. His loyalists shuffled uncomfortably, and a few skeptics stifled laughs. She didn't press further. She just leaned back and let the silence hang until Jerry's face turned crimson. Behind the scenes, though, things were getting darker. My wife had been digging into HOA records during the weeks before the hearing, not out of spite but because she suspected Jerry's zeal wasn't just about order. She had noticed oddities, budget reports that didn't balance, invoices from companies that didn't exist, and checks signed over to names no one recognized. It wasn't proof yet, but it smelled bad. She knew corruption when she saw it, and Jerry was neck deep. She shared pieces of it with me late at night, laying out documents on the dining table like evidence boards from her office. She traced lines between Jerry's personal bank account and HOA funds, highlighting transfers that screamed embezzlement. She found a landscaping company that had billed the HOA thousands of dollars but hadn't touched a single blade of grass in months. The deeper she dug, the more tangled it became. This wasn't just a power trip. This was theft hidden behind lawn ordinances. Meanwhile, Jerry's panic began to show. He cornered neighbors in driveways, demanding loyalty. He whispered about conspiracies, painting my wife as a bully who wanted to dismantle the HOA altogether. He went door to door clutching a clipboard, sweating under the weight of his unraveling authority. Those who once followed him began to avoid him, dodging his gaze, shutting doors when he approached. His control was slipping. The twist came one night when my wife found a connection that changed everything. Buried in the financial records was a property deal, a suspicious transfer of land on the edge of the neighborhood. The buyer was listed as a shell company, but the signature on the paperwork matched Jerry's handwriting. He had been using HOA funds to funnel money into his own investments, essentially forcing neighbors to bankroll his private ventures. It was bold, reckless, and illegal. She didn't tell Jerry she knew. She didn't tell anyone. She wanted to let him walk into the next meeting thinking he was still in control. The more rope he had, the more dramatic the fall would be. I asked her if she planned to go to the county immediately, but she shook her head. No, she said, this isn't just about stopping him. It's about showing this neighborhood what he really is. If she exposed him quietly, people might dismiss it as politics. But if she caught him red-handed in front of everyone, his empire of clipboards and bylaws would collapse overnight. The next HOA meeting was scheduled for a week later, and Jerry was more desperate than ever. He had begun fabricating new complaints, claiming we hosted loud parties that didn't exist, accusing us of parking illegally when our car sat squarely in our driveway. He even circulated a rumor that my wife had threatened neighbors with her service weapon, a claim so outrageous it drew laughter instead of fear. But Jerry didn't see the humor. He was clawing for relevance, and everyone could see it. At home, the atmosphere was different. My wife was calm, collected, but sharper than I had ever seen her. She organized her notes meticulously, cross-referenced every document, and rehearsed what she would say if pressed. It wasn't just about winning, It was about doing it clean, airtight, undeniable. She wasn't preparing for a neighborhood spat. She was preparing for a takedown. The night before the meeting, she leaned back in her chair, staring at the ceiling. I asked if she was nervous. She shook her head. Nervous is when you don't know what's coming, she said. This is more like waiting for a storm I can already see on the radar. Jerry doesn't know it yet, but he's the one standing in the open field holding a metal pole. The stage was set. Jerry thought he was preparing to humiliate us with trumped-up charges, but my wife was ready to flip the script. The hearing wouldn't just expose his pettiness, it would unravel his entire operation. The community was about to see that their HOA president wasn't a watchdog but a fox in the henhouse. And Jerry, blinded by arrogance, was walking straight into it. The community center was overflowing the night of the showdown. Cars spilled into the grass by the parking lot, and people who hadn't attended an HOA meeting in years suddenly discovered their civic duty. Inside, folding chairs filled every inch of space, neighbors buzzing like they were waiting for a prize fight. Jerry had orchestrated the event like a spectacle, strutting up front with his gavel and his rented microphone, chest puffed as though this was a national broadcast. He had even convinced a few allies to stand behind him, creating the illusion of authority. My wife sat near the front, legs crossed, her expression calm. She had brought no allies, no props, no theatrics. She didn't need them. Jerry launched into his speech, dripping with self-importance. He spoke of rules and fairness, community pride, and the dangers of letting people. And here he looked directly at us, trample on standards. He waved papers in the air, claiming they were evidence of our lawlessness. He projected photos on a screen, our garden gnomes, our recycling bin, a shot of our car parked perfectly legal but framed like a crime scene. Each image was accompanied by his narration, painting us as neighborhood terrorists. A few of his loyalists clapped. Most people shifted uncomfortably. When he announced the charges, yes, he called them charges, against us, he slammed the gavel for emphasis. Unauthorized decorations. Failure to comply with trash regulations. Disruption of community peace. It sounded like the setup for a bad sitcom, but Jerry spoke as if he were unveiling Watergate. My wife didn't flinch. She let him ride his wave of self-importance, her silence drawing the room tighter with anticipation. Then Jerry made his fatal move. He produced what he claimed was a log of suspicious activity at our home. It was a handwritten sheet of nonsense, noting things like porch light turned on after 11 p.m. and neighbor seen leaving with pizza box. He declared this proof that we were abusing our position, hinting at criminal behavior. That was the moment my wife stood. The room fell silent. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. She began by thanking Jerry for his dedication to the community, a line so dripping with irony it drew a few chuckles. Then she asked, calmly, if Jerry could explain why thousands of HOA dollars had been paid to a landscaping company that didn't exist. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Jerry froze. She pulled a folder from her bag, flipping it open to reveal copies of invoices, checks, and property records. She laid out, step by step, how funds had been siphoned off into shell companies and how one of those companies was connected directly to Jerry. Every document was clear, every number undeniable. She spoke with the precision of a prosecutor, weaving the story so that even the most loyal Jerry supporters were leaning forward, faces pale. Jerry sputtered, tried to object, claimed the records were fabricated. My wife, unbothered, produced the county clerk's stamps, official signatures, and dates. The room erupted into whispers, neighbors staring at Jerry as if they were seeing him for the first time. His allies behind him shifted uneasily, suddenly less like a board and more like accomplices caught in headlights. Then came the twist. My wife revealed the property deal, the land Jerry had quietly bought using HOA money funneled through his shell company. She explained how he planned to flip it for personal profit while raising dues to cover his theft. She didn't accuse him with fury. She laid it out with cold clarity, like a detective presenting evidence. By the time she finished, the narrative was no longer about flamingos or trash cans. It was about embezzlement, betrayal, and a man who had exploited his neighbors for years. Jerry panicked. He shouted that this was slander, that she was abusing her badge. He slammed his gavel until it broke, the head flying across the floor. The crowd laughed, the tension cracking open. Someone shouted for him to resign. Another demanded answers about missing funds. Jerry's face turned beet red, sweat dripping as he tried to shout over the noise. But the tide had turned. Then a surprise ally stepped in. Mr. Liu, usually quiet, stood and announced that he had served as treasurer 2 years ago and had noticed irregularities back then. He had been dismissed when he questioned them. He confirmed that what my wife uncovered matched what he had seen. His voice, calm but firm, was the nail in Jerry's coffin. Neighbors began shouting, demanding Jerry step down, demanding an investigation. Jerry tried one last desperate move. He accused my wife of orchestrating the whole thing, of planting evidence to destroy him. But before he could finish, one of his own board members spoke up, admitting that Jerry had pressured them into signing blank checks. The board crumbled in real time, members distancing themselves from him, voices raised in protest. It was chaos, but chaos that spelled his end. Through it all, my wife stood steady, watching as the man who had called the cops on her now drowned in his own lies. She didn't gloat, didn't raise her voice. She simply stated that she would be forwarding all documents to the county for formal investigation. She thanked the community for their time, then sat back down. The room exploded, not with applause, but with a storm of angry voices directed at Jerry. By the time the meeting ended, Jerry was a shell of himself. His allies had abandoned him, his gavel lay broken, and his carefully built empire of clipboards and bylaws was rubble. Neighbors who had once whispered against us now lined up to apologize, to thank my wife for exposing the truth. The public humiliation was complete. As we walked out into the cool night, the neighborhood buzzing behind us, my wife turned to me with a small smile. She hadn't just defended herself. She had dismantled a petty tyrant with the weight of his own corruption. The showdown was over, but the fallout was only beginning. The night after the hearing, the neighborhood felt like it had been cracked open. People who used to pass each other with polite nods were now huddled in clusters, whispering about Jerry's downfall. Porch lights flickered on late into the evening, curtains twitched, and voices carried over fences. The story was spreading faster than wildfire, not just in our cul-de-sac but across town. By morning, the county had already contacted my wife for copies of her findings. She delivered the folder with the same efficiency she would for any case, and within hours, a formal investigation was underway. Jerry, the man who had tried to rule over lawn clippings and pink flamingos, was suddenly the subject of real law enforcement. The first fallout came quickly. Neighbors who had backed Jerry with enthusiasm began backpedaling, claiming they had never truly supported him. Mrs. Patterson, who had practically built a nest at her window to spy on us, showed up on our porch with a casserole, stammering about how she always respected my wife's position. My wife accepted it with a polite smile, though I could tell she found it ironic. Mr. Liu received a wave of gratitude from nearly everyone, finally recognized for the warnings he had given years ago. For the first time in a long while, the neighborhood wasn't gossiping about lawns. They were gossiping about embezzlement and fraud. Jerry, meanwhile, was in freefall. His face grew pale, his energy manic. He paced his yard muttering, waving his clipboard like a broken sword. Within a week, deputies arrived at his door. The sight of him being led out in handcuffs was both surreal and strangely fitting. Neighbors lined the street, some filming on their phones, others simply watching in silence. The man who once strutted around with imagined authority was now bundled into the back of a cruiser, his gavel's head still missing from the night it had flown across the community center floor. My wife didn't attend the arrest. She said only that it wasn't her case anymore. She had exposed the truth. The law would handle the rest. The HOA board dissolved almost immediately after. Without Jerry's iron grip, members resigned one by one, some admitting they had been pressured, others simply embarrassed to be associated with him. For a few weeks, the neighborhood was leaderless, the bylaws gathering dust as people realized the sky wouldn't fall if a trash can sat out past Tuesday. There was almost a sense of relief. Neighbors who had once been at odds shared nods of solidarity, united by the strange theater they had endured. But the fallout wasn't just administrative. It was personal. People began confessing small resentments, how Jerry had fined them unfairly, how he had singled them out, how they had been too afraid to speak up. My wife listened when they came to her, though she didn't promise to fix everything. She reminded them that a neighborhood wasn't held together by rules or fines but by mutual respect. Her word stuck, and slowly, fences became less like boundaries and more like shared spaces again. The county eventually released its findings. Jerry had embezzled tens of thousands of dollars over several years, using shell companies and fake invoices to line his pockets. The property scheme sealed his fate. He was charged with fraud, embezzlement, and abuse of trust. The news spread across local papers, and suddenly our little HOA scandal was a countywide cautionary tale. People shook their heads at the absurdity of it. How a man had gone from measuring lawns to facing prison time. Neighbors who had once whispered about my wife now approached her with open gratitude. Some even apologized outright for believing Jerry's rumors. She accepted their words with grace, but she never sought their validation. For her, the work was done. She hadn't taken down Jerry for revenge. She had done it because corruption, no matter how small, rots everything it touches. One afternoon, the community gathered at the park for an informal meeting. Without an official board, it was just neighbors talking, kids playing, dogs chasing each other across the grass. There was laughter again, the kind that had been missing during Jerry's reign of clipboards. People suggested rewriting the HOA charter, this time with checks and balances, transparency, and a reminder that the goal was to protect, not to control. My wife didn't volunteer for the board. She didn't want to rule the neighborhood. She simply reminded them to keep it human, not bureaucratic. The strangest part of the aftermath was the way our own violations became legendary. The pink flamingos remained in the yard, untouched, no longer symbols of rebellion but of resilience. Neighbors who once sneered at them now chuckled, even asked where we bought them. The recycling bin became a running joke, and the garden gnomes were practically mascots of the street. What Jerry had tried to weaponize as infractions had transformed into emblems of freedom. Life settled back into rhythm, though the memory of those flashing police lights never fully faded. Sometimes, on quiet evenings, I'd catch my wife sipping her coffee on the porch, looking out over the yard like she was still on duty. She never gloated, never reminded anyone that she had been right from the start. Her satisfaction came from the calm that returned, from knowing the community could breathe again. The final chapter closed quietly, not with a bang but with a kind of peace. Jerry went off to face his charges, the neighborhood rebuilt itself, and my wife went back to her real work, protecting the county from dangers that actually mattered. And yet, in its own bizarre way, the HOA saga had reminded everyone of something important. Authority misused, no matter how small the stage, could cause real damage. But truth, patience, and a steady hand could dismantle even the pettiest of empires. As for our lawn, it never did meet Jerry's impossible standards. The grass was sometimes too long, the lights sometimes too bright, and the flamingos forever too pink. But nobody cared anymore. What once drew threats and police cruisers now drew smiles. It was our lawn, our home, our little piece of stubborn freedom. And in the end, that was all it ever needed to be.